FastAPI is a popular Python library that can be used for creating APIs. With FastAPI, creating an API can be as simple as this. I've imported FastAPI, created an instance of this API, and then defined a handler function which gets called when a GET request is made to the path specified in the decorator. So how do you run this API so that it can receive requests? Well, to run it, we need a web server that will listen for requests made to your computer, pass them to FastAPI, and then return a response. The FastAPI docs recommend using Unicorn as your web server. You can install it using pip. And then once you've done that, you can run your API file like this. The command expects the name of the file and the name of the instance of the API within that file, separated by a colon as its first argument. And when you run that, it starts running the API locally. So you can see some info logged by this API, which has been printed to the console here. It says that Unicorn's running the API on my local machine, that's my local IP address, on port 8000, which is where it's listening to requests from. Now that it's running, I can make requests to this API and get this message as a response when I make a GET request to the root endpoint of this API. Let me do that now. So what I've done there is I've used the request library to make a GET request to just the root, very base endpoint of this API, which is running on, like I said, port 8000 of my local machine, and then printed the JSON of the response, which looks like that. And you can also see that what's happened on the API has been logged in that console output there. You can see that a GET request is made, it returned a 200 status code, which is a good one, means okay. One issue is that if I make any changes to this API and save them, they're not going to be reflected in this response, because that same API that was in existence before I'd saved this file after making the changes is still handling the requests. So what you can do to change that is you can run the same command as earlier with a -- reload flag. That means it's going to hot reload. So any changes that are made in this file, they're going to be reflected without having to restart the API again. So if I run this now, it's going to respond with this, which is what it was started as. But then if I add something back in and save it, you can see that it's restarted automatically. It's hot reloaded. I haven't had to restart it manually. And then if I run it, it's going to give me a different response. So this is really useful for developing and debugging your API as you go. Alternatively to running the API from the terminal, you can actually get it to run from within the Python file. Then you can just run it as a Python file like usual to start running the API in the same way. So to do that, you can import Unicorn and then do unicorn.run and pass it the instance of your API. And you should probably put this in a if name equals main block, so that it only runs when you run this file directly. Now, instead of having to run the Unicorn from terminal, I can just run the Python file. This doesn't hot reload, so you might not want to do that whilst you're developing, but instead of having to remember the exact terminal command that you use to run the API, you can simply put all those parameters inside here, and then you just have to call run the API using Python. I'm going to run it from the terminal now so I can use the hot reloading. FastAPI has many different decorators that can be used to define what happens to any different HTTP method sent to your API. So you can define what happens to put requests to that route, delete requests to that route, post requests to that route, and all the other usual HTTP methods. So if I change that to a post and then try and make this request, which is a GET, I'm probably going to have an issue. It says method not allowed, and it says, yeah, method not allowed to that path. So what I need to do here is change that to a post request and run this again. And then it all works fine. So you can, of course, define many different handlers to build up an API which does something that you might imagine will be used in the real world. So for example, I can add different methods here. I can say, let's say I've got one which is a get request to the /user path, and then I'll define a method which is gonna get the user data. What that does is it goes to a database and it gets the user attributes and then it returns them. I can have another method which puts something into the user's basket. And you can build up this API tree of all different kind of useful methods which do useful things to build whatever application you want. You should note that you can't overwrite a handler method because FastAPI looks through all of your different handlers in order and runs the first handler, which it sees matches the right request and the right path. So I have two handlers which define what happens to the same type of request at the same endpoint. Then only the first one is going to be run. So using this very basic example, you can create production-ready APIs to respond to requests for any possible use case with FastAPI. There's a lot more detail that goes into it, and you can take this to a lot more complicated applications, but that's the basics, and that's good enough to get started.